So with interest rates and inflation on the rise, but job numbers still growing, we're in for a total change in the economy from what we've experienced over the last few years this year in 2022. Stay tuned for this episode of More About Mortgages, where I dive into where we're currently at in the economy and what we're going to expect over the next few months and into the latter parts of 2022. Thank you guys for joining me for another episode of More About Mortgages. My name's Ian Moore and I'm a loan officer here at Premier Mortgage Lending. And I appreciate you guys all joining me for another episode. Make sure, if you haven't already, to please like and subscribe my channel. I greatly appreciate anybody who does like and subscribe. Thank you guys very much. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the current real estate and mortgage lending markets, as well as the rising interest rates and inflation, the job numbers, and lastly, the supply chain issues, where we're at right now with it, and where we're going to be headed over the next few months. So, let's dive right in. Obviously, the jobs report comes out first Friday of every month, and as of recently, we were expecting about 430,000 new jobs created over the last month or so, when in reality, only about 199,000 new jobs were created, which, after modifying over the last few months, is actually not as significant of a decrease as what it sounds like, honestly. You see 199,000 new jobs created when the expectation was 430. You're like, wow, that's not good for the economy. That's a real hit. But ultimately, they modify the numbers based on a monthly basis, and kind of like when you were in school and some of your teachers would scale your grades. That's sort of how this works as well. They scale it back, and when modified and scaled, it's really not that bad. 200,000 new jobs were created, which ultimately is pretty good. And these are all determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They come out with the jobs report and the jobs numbers, which haven't been overly too bad. The unemployment numbers, which correlate also with the jobs report, however, instead of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is done through the household survey, which unemployment done by the household survey has shown to decrease by over 483,000 new jobs. So that's huge. 483,000 new jobs have been created, which unemployment, just to give you guys a breakdown of what it looks like, pre-pandemic times, the unemployment rate was in the threes, even below 3 slightly. Middle of the pandemic, it jumped up to over 15% unemployment rates, highest we've ever seen as a country in general. And right now we're down to about 4.2%. And for the first time, or actually over the last few months, we've been hovering around 4 to 4.5%. And for the first time since the pandemic, the unemployment rate is now under 4% at 3.9. That is huge news, guys, and a great indicator for where the economy is headed. With the job numbers coming back steadily, the unemployment rate dropping steadily, despite the rising interest rates and inflation in the country, there are good signs indicating a positive future for the economy here in the United States. So with the jobs numbers and jobs report improving, not necessarily coming into our expectations, but still steadily improving every month, and the unemployment rate going down steadily every month, we definitely have some positive indicators in the economy. So with inflation, the goal is typically to have an inflation rate of 2% or less as a country. As of right now, we're operating at an inflation rate of 7% or higher, which is not good. So we need to really work on that and start implementing some resolutions to overcome that high inflation, which we already are doing and the government is working on and striving towards that 2% or less inflation rate. So inflation is still on the rise, and inflation is going to continue to be on the rise throughout the greater part of this year, most likely, and we need to encounter and come up with a resolution for the inflation. And what the government is actually working on now has sort of stemmed away from the jobs numbers and more towards the inflation, because the high rates of inflation, unless we attack that and start looking at implementations that'll bring that back down, that's going to be the biggest problem in the economy that we're going to be faced with this year. So higher interest rates, high inflation, what that means for you. So with rates already increasing since the pandemic, over a half a point, really, 3/4 of a point, sometimes even a point, depending on the program, since about Q3 of 2021, that's a pretty sizable increase in an interest rate. And that changes a lot of buying power for you home buyers out there and what it means for you and how much house you can afford. I mean, ultimately, somebody that was pre-approved in August even of 2021 last year, or September, October even, maybe even November you were pre-approved, and at an interest rate of 2.99, 3.25, somewhere in there. Well, your pre-approval has completely been altered at this point. You need to contact your loan officer if they haven't reached out to you already to restructure your pre-approval because you may not qualify for as much of a house now as you did 6 months ago, 3 months ago, because of the increased interest rates. So in a normal time, in a normal market, that would mean a slowdown in the real estate market, in the mortgage lending business. The high levels of inflation, the higher interest rates would ultimately mean a slower time in this business. But with the high levels of demand that we're seeing right now, meaning higher and higher numbers of home buyers out there that just don't have a house to get into and make an offer that gets accepted on, we're not going to see that. And market analysts and economy experts are predicting that we're not going to see a slowdown in the real estate market. That as long as come March, April, and May, these sellers start listing their homes and, do not continue to procrastinate and delay listing their houses and selling, then we're going to see a normal year this year and have it ramp up just like we have over the last few years when the spring market hit, which is great news for mortgage lenders out there, for real estate agents out there. That's a very positive sign for the future. Despite the higher level of interest rates and the higher levels of inflation that we're encountering, we're not going to see a slowdown in the real estate market provided the inventory level gets spiked here in the near future, which we've seen every year since I've been a loan officer anyway, so I don't see why it would be any different this year. Because as long as inventory picks up, those who are out there waiting to sell, you're going to be able to sell your house for top dollar, more than it's ever been worth in your entire lifetimes, and ultimately be able to find another property and get into that fairly quickly, which would be ideal. So we have the jobs report, the unemployment numbers, the high rates of inflation coupled with the higher interest rates, and what that means for you: less buying power, maybe restructuring your pre-approval to match the higher interest rates with the fewer buying power or fewer lower purchase price maybe. Maybe readjust the loan program that you're using so you can keep the same down payment, keep the same structure, but maybe still qualify for the same price point. All right, guys, so now that we've touched on the rising interest rates and inflation coupled with the jobs report numbers and the unemployment rate coming down, we're going to hit into the supply chain issues and everything we've encountered in that field over the last few months and even dating back to the beginning of the pandemic. So let's start with what exactly the supply chain even is. A supply chain is a series of facilities through which a product, like a printer or a soda can, a printer, a soda can, or all the materials that comprise that printer or soda can, like a computer chip or fructose corn syrup for that matter, just to get a little bit more detail, travel through. So ultimately, you think of the finished product that you walk into a grocery store or a retail store and purchase off the counter or the shelf, but that's only the finished product. The supply chain entails all of the minor products that make up that finished product as well, and where those minor products came from and traveled through. So it's very complex and diverse. The supply chain itself is not as cookie cutter and straightforward as you might think it would be because of all the minute products that make up these finished products as a whole. So it starts with raw materials, and then those are turned into semi-finished goods. They finally travel to a manufacturing plant where the finished goods are finally made. The product then may be stored at a warehouse or facility and distributed later to retail stores where they are finally sold to consumers like you and me. That's a lot of traveling and a lot of chain of supply for ultimately that finished good to wind up in the retail store or grocery store for you and I to go buy it off the shelf. That's a lot of room for interruption. And ultimately, it's a combination of two reasons why we've been faced with these issues in the supply chain over these last 6 to 12 months. It's a combination of the demand is exceeding capacity in both production and logistics. And by logistics, really, I just mean transportation and traveling through the supply chains and the complex web of the supply chain. Second, there is a lack of redundancy in the existing supply chain. Therefore, two reasons why we're faced with the supply chain issues that we've encountered over the last 6, 12 months. Again, exceeding capacity in both production and logistics or transportation, and ultimately a lack of redundancy in the existing supply chain. What I mean by the second part, a lack of redundancy, is that it's not as straightforward as you would think. There are multiple different tiers and levels of the supply chain, minor parts that make up a whole product, whole products, food, retail supplies, paper products. Sometimes, most times, in fact, food products travel through the supply chain faster than, goods or services or products that are going to go to like a, a Radio Shack or another store like that has products that can sit for a while, food typically likes to travel through the supply chain faster and get to its final destination faster so that it can get into your and I's home faster and consumed by us faster. Ultimately, we're running into even more issues with the supply chain in the food front because with those things having to move faster to stay fresh and to stay good, we're going to be getting even more capacity issues on that front. Capacity issues and lack of labor, lack of available employees to hire at these warehouses and these production facilities. So they're all strapped for employees, strapped for help, and strapped for labor. Because of the pandemic and the lack of revenue that they've had, they're operating at very limited revenue, most likely the lowest they've had in their careers since owning their businesses. So they only have the means to hire so many employees and have so many laborers working for them. So they need to work more efficiently and faster with fewer capacity and fewer help and employees and ultimately materials as well because of the overall supply chain issues we've been faced with. So it's a big complex web, but ultimately guys, it boils down to what you and I really need to know as typical consumers, which is we're faced with the supply chain issue now and into the foreseeable future until ultimately the higher levels of inflation can get resolved and the economy can get back on a good front in all aspects. The job numbers, the unemployment rates, the supply chain, everything needs to come back to a front before we're in a place where you and I can walk into the grocery store and know for certain that those ranch wheat thins are going to be on the counter when we get in there. Because let me tell you, these last 6 months, it went from maybe half the time they'd be on the shelf to no times to 0%. So yeah, I'd like to get some ranch wheat thins back here pretty soon. So hopefully we can get these issues wrapped up sooner than later. Anyway, there's certainly some positives to take out of the track the economy is on in January now in the first quarter of 2022. I'm excited about it. I'm excited that we're certainly not going to run into a slowdown in the real estate and mortgage lending markets despite the higher interest rates and higher levels of inflation. That's certainly a scary time for us as loan officers and real estate agents in a normal market when the demand is not absolutely through the roof and home buyers are not out there by the dozens looking for their new home. So that's the good catalyst that we have right now to lean on, is that there are tons of home buyers out there looking for their new home. They just need the inventory to start making some more offers and get those offers accepted. And that's what we're all about. And I want to help you get those offers accepted. So thank you guys for joining me for another episode of More About Mortgages. I know there's been a lot of information here. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Make sure if you do, you comment on the video underneath. I'd be happy to get back to you and reply with any answers to your questions. And again, if you could like and subscribe or have your friends and family like and subscribe, guys, I would greatly appreciate it, and I appreciate you. Thank you. Have a great week, everybody. Stay safe.